Hey, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our webcast today for National History Day. And I'm Ellen Dornan. I'm the state coordinator for National History Day in New Mexico. And this is part of a series of webcasts that we're offering to National History Day teachers and students to help with your projects and help you through preparing projects for the contests. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me at historyday@nmhum.org, or you can type your questions into the chat box on the YouTube page. Today we're very fortunate to be joined by Rick Hendricks, who is the New Mexico State Historian, and he's going to be talking with us a little bit about doing research for local history projects. And thank you for joining us today, Rick.
Well, thank you, Ellen. It's my pleasure.
So let's just start talking a little bit about why do local history? What about local history makes for a good History Day project?
Well, first of all, I would say that I always, when people ask about local history, I always like to refer them to Joseph A. Amato's book, Rethinking Home. If you're not familiar with that, it's where we get the quote, "All history is local." And so I think that's an important thing to consider. One of the things he talks about in his book is that that if you're telling a local story, it's often more intimate to you. You know more detail about it. You may know things about it that you wouldn't necessarily know about a national story. And it enables you to look at in looking at local history, you can see a microcosm of history, and then you can look at that specific local event and easily translate that into a national or an international story. So I think specifically about National History Day, one of the things that if you're interested in possibly being a competitive person in National History Day and you want to maybe go to on to a national competition, then I think it's important that you consider, can I tell a local story in the way that only maybe I would be able to tell it as a New Mexican, that would somehow resonate on the national level. And I think that almost all historians at some level are using elements of local history. Certainly, as a New Mexico State historian, a lot of what I'm doing is local history, but it often can be very, very easy to see how that would fit into the national picture. So that's one reason to do it, looking at the National History Day. The other thing is that if you use local history as your focus, then you're going to be able to rely on research materials that will be more or less readily accessible to you. Now, New Mexico is a big state, so it often involves a little bit of traveling. But you could pick a topic that you found quite fascinating that was more national in focus, and you might really struggle to get sources. And one of the things that I always like to see in National History Day is people working in primary sources. And so for local history, we have an abundance of material on that. So those are kind of two different ways of looking at it that I think are important, and why it's a good idea to do one.
Well, I think both of those are really good criteria for choosing the topic. That availability of primary sources is a huge one. So where should students look for local history archives? I mean, say there was a kid down in Silver City who was doing a project on the Apache. Where would be a good place in the area to start looking?
Okay, so Silver City is a great example. Obviously, the university in town is always going to be a good source, not only for archival material, but to go. I always recommend go talk to an archivist. Get face-to-face with an archivist, tell them what you're interested in, and they can help you. They're going to have something in their own collection that would be of interest to you that you might not be able to find, say, searching on the card catalog. It's always useful to go. And the other thing is in Silver City, the public library, local museums, they also have a lot of material. So those are good sources. So I would say, generally speaking, in any community, public libraries and public librarians. Almost all public libraries in New Mexico have some local history sections where they collect material specifically on local history. The same thing is true with museums. They're going to have artifacts. They're going to have knowledgeable people that work there. They're often going to have archival collections. Most people don't realize that many museums have archival collections to support the curation of their materials. University campus, if there's one close by, obviously Western New Mexico there in Silver City. It's not that far to Las Cruces. A lot of resources there. State Archives here in Santa Fe. And one thing that I'm kind of big on that's overlooked a lot is city and county archives. Now, not all municipalities in New Mexico have archives, but all the counties do. And the counties have a lot of material, and they're usually very happy to have people consult those materials because it's not something that is really all that common for people to do research. And especially if you're doing local history, if you're interested in a particular family or a property or various different things, you'll find that if you go to the office of the Clerk of Court, they'll have lots of records that will be very informative about lots of different local topics. So those would be sort of the main things in terms of sort of institutions. And then I would say you would want to look at documents, of course, primary documents there. I'm also, I like to see people do research in photographs, but one of the things that we see is a lot of people, for example, for National History Day, will do presentations and they include photographs, but they don't really dig out all the information that's in a photograph. And a lot of times that may require talking to somebody who, show a photograph to somebody who has some expertise in the area, maybe a family member. But there's a lot of information that can be derived from a photograph, what people are wearing, what sort of activities they're involved in, other than just sort of, well, here's a picture of a general store in 1885. I mean, they're often really, really full of information. And, you can go to, say, Library of Congress. There are various places where you can get information about, and this probably would be maybe at this point more information for teachers, but there are places that can show you how to really dig the information out of a photograph rather than just use it for an illustration. So that's one thing. And another thing that's really, really important, and it's often overlooked, and I haven't seen very many National History Day projects that have really utilized this much, and that's newspapers. Now it's possible to do an amazing amount of research in newspapers online. So if you go to a public library or a university library, they'll often have historic newspaper databases. And the amount of research that you can do has really transformed, I would say in the last 15 years, 20 years, it's really transformed how historians work with, say, from the middle of the 19th century on. So the 1850s to the present, newspapers are an incredible source of information. And again, they're often overlooked because it wasn't really all that many years ago where the only way you could do it would be spend hours and hours cranking a microfilm reader, and now you don't have to do that. And so I would really encourage people to do that. And the other thing is that from that, oftentimes you can get quotes and interviews and various different things from people. So those would be sort of if I was saying, where are you going to look at, what kind of material you're going to look at, those would be really important points, I think.
So I know that I know that a lot of historic New Mexico newspapers have been digitized and archived through the UNM's e-library portal, and that newspapers from all over the state are discoverable through, say, the state archives or the Rocky Mountain Online Archives. But what on the county level, if people are looking for material, should they be expecting to be able to find them on the internet, or to be able to find digital versions that are already available?
On the county level, there are not that many records. There, the project that or the two projects that I guess I'm most closely associated with would be Rio Arriba County and Doña Ana County, so two widely separated counties, are doing a lot of work with digitizing material. It's not available on the internet now. Some of the records are, but the plan going forward is that, certainly in the case of Doña Ana County, is they will eventually try to get most of that material scanned and online. Most county archives are going to require a visit to the clerk of court of that county right now. And I'm sure that most people would be aware that most counties don't have the resources to engage in large-scale scanning projects at this point. And the other thing is that the infrastructure, the computer infrastructure that's required to make that available, to have it safely backed up, it's quite an expense, and everyone wants to have access to everything digitally, and then there's also the question of how long do the digital images last. It's kind of a whole other thing we don't need to get into now, but basically, although some counties are moving in that direction, that probably is going to require a visit to them. But I think most people who go to a county archive will be amazed how much material they have. I think just be you blow away when you look at the number of books and documents that they'll have, and the information that they contain. It's pretty amazing stuff.
So I've never done this myself, but I'm guessing the kind of records that a student might find in a county clerical court, that's what it's called, the
clerk of court, yeah.
The clerical court would be, say, birth and death records. So
in a typical clerk of court's office that maintains those records, you'll find all the land that would be buying and selling property. There are birth and death records. Some of those, some of the access is restricted to that for a variety of reasons. But one of the really rich sources is probate records. So people die in their will, you can find out their estates. But if there's a complicated probate file, you can find out what happened to the children, maybe how they were educated. There's all sorts of information that you can find, mining history. You had to apply for licenses for almost any kind of business in New Mexico. So there's a lot more variety than what you would imagine. Well, mostly it's going to be deeds and that sort of stuff. And it certainly, there is a lot of that, but there's a lot of other material that relates to social history that you can't really find anywhere else. Nowadays, so if, in the 21st century, certainly, estates are probated in a different way, but in the early 20th century and then in the 19th century, the probate records are often the only place you can find that sort of thing. But for example, they have reports of criminal activity. The big exciting news that they found in Doña Ana County earlier in the year, when they found the coroner's jury report for Pat Garrett's murder. So there are a lot of different kind of things that show up in those records that don't really make it into any other. So court cases of all kinds, they're also recorded there. And that's just that's the clerk of court for that. I mean, there are other kind of records that would be in a county assessor's office. So there are lots of different things that depending on what you're looking for. But if you're working on a particular individual or you're working on a community and you want to kind of reconstruct the history of that community, that's a really good place to start. You can find who owned the land, and a lot of the land records will have little maps drawn of where their land was, and it's really quite fascinating.
So I'm thinking of a couple of local history projects I've seen over the last couple of years. I remember a few years ago there was a girl from Farmington who went to Tibbetts Middle School, and so she did a project on Paul Tibbetts, who was from Farmington, and he was a World War II hero. So if she went into the clerical court and said, I'm doing research on Paul Tibbetts, what kind of help could she expect? And would she expect to, say, be able to make copies or be charged fees for making copies?
So most of the time when you go to the office of the Clerk of Court, so Clerk of Court.
Clerk of Court, okay.
They would be able to direct you to a variety of records. For example, you could probably find out where Mr. Tibbetts had owned property and how he had acquired it. If he was involved in buying and selling real estate. And most people over the course of a lifetime will not live in the same place. They'll move around. If he had a will and the will was probated, then you would find other information about the family. If he was involved in any sort of criminal activity, you might be able to find a record of that too. So it's pretty easy to start to reconstruct certain aspects of a person's life by looking at those records. It's if you spend a few hours working on a person and you take careful notes of what you've got, you'll begin to see when a person arrived in a community, what they were involved in. And if you know, for example, they owned a business or operated a business, you might be able to check and see, what the circumstances were with that. Now, most of them do charge a fee for the copying. So you kind of have to make a decision. Do I want to take careful notes? Do I want to copy this material? I mean, but the counties pretty much have to recover their expenses on, to some extent, the people time and then the paper time. So there would be a fee for copying, but I do a lot of that work, and I don't ever have a copy. I just make notes. Just do it the old-fashioned way.
Some of the kids just use their phones to take pictures of the documents.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, you're not allowed to take pictures. That varies from place to place. Some places will allow to do that. Some won't. Yeah, I don't know if there's a statewide rule or whether it's county by county, but most of them, if you want a copy, they're going to make the copy for you. Although many of the collections have all been microfilmed. And so you can get a copy of the microfilm and you wouldn't have to, as a matter of fact, increasingly, you wouldn't actually handle the books. You would just find the material on the microfilm. And the nice thing about that is that in many cases, the record that you're looking at may have been linked to several other records that you would have no way of knowing existed, but for the county's purposes, they've created links among various different kinds of documents. So if they have that kind of a system, again, it depends on which county you're in, but if they already have that, then you can really be off to the races in terms of tracking down what kind of information they have. So some of it you have to do all yourself, and you have to be a little bit creative, and sometimes you'll find a situation where it'll just sort of lead you through. And, both of those are very viable ways to do the research.
Right. So I don't know whether you would know this, but I know at UNM, when you're working with microfilm, you can print it to PDF. Mm-hmm. And then if you have a USB drive, you can save that PDF to your USB. Are the counties equipped that way?
I really don't know. I imagine there probably are a couple of counties that have that, but I don't know, and I don't know what the regulations are. Um, my experience primarily has been them making paper copies, and actually keeping a record of what they'd copied. So I'm not really sure about that. I mean, what you're describing is extremely typical in a university archive. I mean, they don't charge you for the copies; you just make your own copies. But I don't think the counties are really set up to do that yet. At least I don't think they are.
Well, if anybody from the county is watching, it's awesome to make PDFs from microfilm.
Well, and it may vary. It may vary too.
So going back to this girl who's learning about Paul Tibbets, I mean, okay, so it's the Clerk of Court.
Yes.
So she goes into the Clerk of Court. Is there a computer system? Is it a card catalog? I mean, how can she expect to start finding these documents that might point her in the direction she wants?
So again, well, let's just use the one that I know best. Onion County has a computer system. And so you'll go into the county archive, and there'll be books typically of deed records, probate records, all that sort of thing. Sometimes there are also miscellaneous records and files. There's usually not an awful lot of guidance. What would be sort of useful probably would be if a teacher had a group of kids and they were interested in doing that research, maybe set up an appointment, and most counties would be able to give you a tour and tell you how their system worked. I mean, I've actually sat in on a tour that was given to a group of people who were doing community history, and the county was very nice to sort of walk them through it. I don't know all those particulars, how that would be, but I mean, typically you go in, you sign a sheet, and you either have access to a computer terminal and you can start your research that way, or if it's a place that only has books, then typically you're going to be just looking in the books, and the books would be arranged by, say, if you're looking at deed records, they're going to be arranged by the proper. So the simplest way would be the buyer and the seller would be two sets of books. Just look at look for Tibbet's name. That would be how you would go about doing that for that local piece. Some of them might even have, depending on the facility, they might have other records because of draft activity or various other things like that. That would be a good to talk to somebody and say, hey, well, can you give me an idea what else you have besides, court records, and somebody might have other things, and I would imagine that they would probably find out some things that he was involved in that they didn't really know about. But see, another thing, like for example, the reason that newspapers can be so important for somebody like that. I mean, I always say, go after the obituary, find the obituary, right? Then you can find who is married to, who his children are. Oftentimes there'll be lots of other things, civic activities. Was he a Mason? Was he a Kiwanis member? A lot of times that's the only place you're going to get that. Isn't it going to be in an obituary? So it's really important when you're after an individual, you want to go for that. Sort of a hallmark is, always try to get the most recent information, right? So if you're dealing with somebody who's passed away, the information closest to you is going to be the obituary, and that's always a good place to start. Then just kind of work your way back, and then in terms of if you're really interested in how that all works itself out, say he dies and then his wife or children get the property, and you want to continue to say, okay, well, what happened a little bit? How did that work itself out as time went by? You need to know all those people's names too. Then you switch to looking for them, right? So it's similar to maybe doing genealogical research, but you're not really that interested necessarily in, when they were born at that point. You're just trying to say, let's put all these connections together. You can find business partners and all those sorts of things too, looking in those kinds of records. Like, Mr. Tibbets was was involved with such and such a grocery store for whatever, and that kind of thing. And so you can lead yourself off in all these sorts of different directions.
I know researching Spanish colonial things, going back through lawsuits was really valuable because you
Right.
would learn about people's neighbors and relationships, and sometimes random people would come in and present testimony that was illuminating in a way that you didn't expect. But
See,
yeah,
most of those records would be at the state archives, right? The
okay.
court records would, those kind of things, an actual case. If we have those, most of those would have been transferred up here to Santa Fe. So you can find the docket books maybe, but in terms of if you're lucky enough to actually find the papers that constitute the lawsuit, generally speaking, we're going to have those here. Not always, but generally speaking. So I mean, one of the things that I didn't mention, but it's pretty much always true, to really thoroughly do research in New Mexico, you have to, if especially with an individual, you almost have to do county level research and state level research. There's almost no way to get around it because different types of records get archived in different places. And so we have criminal and civil cases tend to be here if they're old enough. And that other stuff like the wills, the probate records, the birth and all those kind of records, those tend to be at the local level. And that can be a hardship if you live in a really long way away from Santa Fe. But that's kind of the situation right now. And although we do have a lot of records that are online, they tend to be the older records, so the Spanish and Mexican records and that sort of thing, not so much the 19th and 20th century stuff. And of course, here at the State Archives, anything more recent than 1912 is really, that's very recent for us. So.
And we've had a number of different librarians advise the students that if they need something from an archive that's not in their town, allow plenty of time, especially with the state library and the state archives, to process your request and get it out to you. So it's not going to happen the week before your project's due, right?
Right. Yeah.
If you're working at a distance and making requests of the archivist, give it 4 weeks, give it 6 weeks, give it as much lead time as you can. So making your request now will get you your material before your project's due, but it's a good vacation activity maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important. And we are understaffed in the state archives, and they do the best they possibly can to respond quickly, but they also get an awful lot of requests. And, it does take time to go find the documents. It also depends on how specific the request is. If you request a document, a specific document in a specific collection, you're going to get a much faster response than if you are asking somebody to, in a sense, do your research for you, which sometimes you can't help. Then it's going to take longer to find it. And of course, part of being in the archive game is that you're behind all the time. So a lot of collections aren't really fully processed, and so it can take a long time to find it, even if it's a pretty specific request. You might ask for a document, a court case that that 1871 is the date when you're pretty sure that's when the trial started. And it may actually end up for a variety of reasons, it may end up in a box of documents from 1873 because it either dragged on or it was appealed or whatever. And so you can imagine the poor archivist looking all the way through 1871, try to help you out, and it's not there. So, well, is it not there because it's not there, or is it not there because it's in a different year? So it is a good idea that when you want something, try to get your request in and try to be as specific as you can as well to help people find it. And that's going to be the case always. The more specific you are, the more fruitful your research is going to be in that kind of situation.
Absolutely. So, I have a couple more questions for you, but we had a question come in that I think is an interesting one. So, somebody just wrote and asked, what about doing research in tribal archives? What do you know about that, or what can you share with people about that?
Well, I don't have any experience in doing that. Most of the people that we've worked with um, through a grant program that we have, we worked with a number of pueblos, um, and most of the time, those archives were really not open to the public. Um, I mean, I have been given the opportunity to work in a number of collections from pueblos, but it was really permission was given to me to do it, but the material wasn't available to the public in general. Now, um, um, I worked with some material that was in the possession, had been in the possession of Santana Pueblo from the time they started acquiring documents in the early 18th century about their land records. And there had been very few people who had been allowed to see them, but they very graciously agreed to put them on loan here at the State Archives. So that's a collection that is, in fact, a part of a Pueblo archive that is available to be consulted here. But generally speaking, the kind of records that they have that have been um, systematically archived have to do with Pueblo land, Pueblo rolls, and that's not available to the general public. So, um, it would require making a request of a Pueblo, and I don't really know of anyone that currently has any sort of an open policy about consulting material. But I'm not particularly knowledgeable about it. I mean, I work with Native American communities they when they ask for my help. I know that New Mexico State University, sometime in the last year, received some papers from Mescalero. I don't know what the access policy is, but that is a fairly substantial piece of a Indian community archive that has been transferred to the university. But I don't know whether it's open to the public or I don't know. But that's another one that is um, at least is in a archive facility that's not at Mescalero. So um, um, I don't really know the answer to that question. Like I say, I have been given permission sometimes, and I many years ago I worked to help create a Pueblo archive, gather material that related to the history of a Pueblo, but I don't know even today whether it's a research facility that you can, or whether it's just for their own purposes. I don't know.
I would actually suggest that anybody doing research on the Pueblos, if that's the kind of tribal archive that you're looking for, um, might try contacting the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. And Rose Diaz there has a pretty significant collection of material that it should be happy to help people work with. I know she said she would help the History Day students.
They do have a lot of records that bear on Pueblo history. So I mean, in that sense, like Court of Private Land Claim records or something like that. I mean, they do have those kind of records there. I mean that's not a Pueblo archive per se, but it's an archive of material that has a lot of information about them. And I know that there's also this really big project that Anandaruta Moya has been working on with a lot of people, to make available a lot of archival material bearing on the history of Native Americans, with a focus on New Mexico, but not limited to New Mexico. And that's a project that will be all the documents will be available online. It'll be searchable. It'll have to do with things like, for example, Pueblo people who went to Carlisle Indian School, the records of that. So a lot of those kinds of records are going to be, and those are records that have been primarily in the National Archives and not really, we don't have copies of them here in New Mexico. And so if you're people who've been interested in doing that kind of research have really had to travel a lot to do them, either to Denver or to the DC area. And so, as time goes on, there'll be more and more of those records, and those are, and they'll be redacted so that if there's material that the Native community considers to be too sensitive, it won't be available, but there'll still be a tremendous amount of stuff. It'll probably be the largest amount of material available, that maybe ever in of that kind of material. And that'll be, it's, they've done some demos of it already. And they haven't quite finished all the work on software, which I think is being developed in England. But that's a big project, and it's got a lot of exciting potential for, one of the things, just to give you an idea, that when they got all the records from Carlisle, what they realized was that it was mostly Pueblo people at certain periods of time, which is, if you've been there to the cemetery and you see that, you would be aware of that there are all these Pueblo people. But most people, when they think of Carlisle Indian School, would never really say, oh, well, that was mostly Pueblo and Apache. You'd think, well, it was Indians from all over, and it was, but it had a very heavy concentration of people from here. So, that's already kind of rewritten the history of what that whole experience was like, and there'll be more and more of that'll come. So,
and where is that being hosted?
It's a web-based thing, and I don't really know I don't know where the computers are.
It's a university.
I'm not even sure of that. Do you know Anna Narita Moya? She used to be.
I don't.
Okay. Well.
Wait, from the National Hispanic Cultural Center?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I've seen the demo. I'm not sure who's hosting it. There are a lot of organizations involved in it. A lot of Native peoples. And I can probably get some information and share it with you, but I don't have it with me right now.
Well, I know that the National Museum of the American Indian is undertaking a huge education project about Native culture and history for the different tribes. So maybe it's in part of that. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think this is a different initiative, but it's a very big project, and it's big in scope and big in the promise of the resources that will be made available. I'm not sure that for the current National History Day there would be enough material. They're just kind of testing it right now, but it'll be coming.
Rick, I had another question. You mentioned earlier that museums are a helpful source of archives. And I know in my own experience, I was looking for some information I couldn't find anywhere else, and it turned out they had it all at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum. Right. That's in the histories of the ranches of the Pecos Valley in southern New Mexico. And there were communities that I could see on these historic maps that I just couldn't find any information about, but it turned out they had these tremendous resources at the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum. So so the question is, what museums have what archives? But maybe you could just sort of, because we're running a little out of time, but maybe you could just point out some of the archives that you think would be useful for History Day researchers.
Well, actually, when I mentioned that, Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum was the one I was thinking of most, because between New Mexico State University and the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, they probably have more information about the farming and ranching history than anybody else. So if you're interested in that, and basically what we're talking about is people who have donated the papers of their ranching operations to those collections. The History Museum here in Santa Fe also has collections. The Fray Angelico Chavez Library has a lot of collections. So those are places that you might not, well, it's called a library, but you wouldn't necessarily think they would have manuscript collections, but they do. So it's one of those things that I recommend that you, if you have a topic that you think is something that might be, well, for example, if you were doing a topic and it related to something like the airfields in Deming, it would make sense to contact the museum in Deming, because people will have given them papers as well. Not all papers go to universities. A lot of them go to museums, especially if the museum is collecting in that area. That's why Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum is sort of a magnet for collections on specific ranches, because that's what they're collecting on. Those are a lot of the people who were supportive in that museum even came about. And so they have some pretty amazing collections of all sorts of things. And then the university does as well, because for many years, of course, there was no Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, and people tended to donate their collections about farming and ranching to NMSU. And I'm sure UNM has as well, but it's always a good idea to ask the people at a museum. Almost all museums are going to have some research collections, because the people who collected the materials that are curated in the museum often will donate their papers. So an anthropology museum would be a really likely place to find the papers of a famous anthropologist, right? It just makes sense that they would be there. Maybe that individual also would have had some association with that institution. So that's, and you know, they'll turn up in the most unlikely places. And a lot of times by going, if you're doing a project and you know that a museum has an exhibit on it, you go there, you talk to a curator and say, well, we actually don't have a manuscript collection related to this, but in Indiana they do, because for some reason that person has a collection, there's some connection to Indiana. So it's always a good idea to talk to the people. Don't just go to the internet and browse their amazing website. Talk to the people that work there. It's almost always the case that they'll have information that maybe they couldn't accommodate in their website. And it may be that it's something they're particularly interested in themselves. And most people are more than willing to help young people doing research, because they're always amazed. Wow, there's a person.
Docents are also a great source of information.
Oh, absolutely.
In my experience, it was a docent who was doing the research on that area, and they said, "Oh well, we'll pull him in because he's been researching all those records and he knows." And so he wasn't museum staff, he wasn't the archivist or the librarian, but he was the person who had been engaging with those records recently and knew everything I needed to ask right off the bat, pointed me in all the right directions. So.
Right. And if you don't go to the museum and ask, you're never going to find that person.
Or at least pick up the phone and call.
Oh, yeah.
And just so students know, some of the things that we've been talking about today, like interview forms, are available from the NHD Resource Center, and materials for analyzing primary source documents are available from the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources site. So all those sorts of resources for how do I do an interview, how do I pick up a phone, how do I call, how do I ask for specific material, those are available, and I can try and post some of those links online. Rick, we're just about out of time today, but is there anything you wanted to add?
Not really. A lot of things we didn't get to, but
Yeah.
no, not really. I mean, there are, this year's topic, conflict and compromise. There are lots of great um, New Mexico topics that also have national implications. So I think if people are interested in going about it that way, it's really it's a rich area, and I encourage people to to look at it that way. So,
So things like the Cold War, the Manhattan Project.
yeah, I
What?
mean, Compromise of 1850. That New Mexico is probably the most important player in that whole thing, and it's even got compromise in the title.
That always helps. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate your joining us. Our next webinar is going to be January 18th of next year, 2018, and Luisa Castillo will be joining us to talk about making a great bibliography. And Rick, I guess we'll see you at the state contest, if not sooner.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thanks again for your time.